and he has personal knowledge of facts and circumstances which would give him probable cause to believe that the person that he is to arrest was the one who committed the crime. In Posadas versus Office of the Ombudsman, Posadas then was the Chancellor of UP. And you very well know that in UP, every now and then, you have the so-called frat wars. If the protagonists are not careful, they might as well end up with fatalities. And that precisely happened during one such incident. So, to help solve the problem, Posadas sought the help of the NBI. And the NBI sent agents 4 days after the incident. They were led by Attorney Dizon. The NBI agents wanted to effect a warrantless arrest of 2 suspects. Posadas and other high officials of UP interceded and made representations with the NBI that they would cause the voluntary surrender of these suspects the following day. The following day came, but no surrender was effected. So what the NBI did was to charge Posadas and company with violation of PD 1829, obstruction of justice. Posadas asked the Ombudsman to dismiss the case, but the Ombudsman would not agree with him. So Posadas went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with Posadas. The Supreme Court said what the NBI agents tried to do in this case could not fall under the so-called hot pursuit exception. The crime is not something that has just happened. It's 4 days already. And the NBI agents had no personal knowledge of facts and circumstances which could have given them probable cause to believe that the persons they were arresting were indeed the ones who committed the crime. Instead, they were relying on alleged witnesses. So that is not personal knowledge. Therefore, when Posadas tried to prevent the NBI from effecting an invalid warrantless arrest, he was just protecting the constitutional rights of the students, for which he could not be held liable for obstruction of justice. The Supreme Court said, dismiss the case against Posadas. A favorite of mine when it comes to hot pursuit is a case that you're not supposed to remember just before you eat. Okay, don't wander too long. I'll tell you the story. Just make sure you don't remember, unless you're dieting, of course. Then you should always remember it every time you eat. It's a case of People versus Saquinho. So let's go to the provinces. In the provinces, the rural areas, you may not have the kind of road system that you have in the city. They may not even be asphalted. They may just be dirt roads. By the sides, you would not have sidewalks. Instead, you would only have grass or shrubbery. The setting for the case is Medellin in Cebu, northern Cebu. There is there a sugar plantation. And 3 men planned an ambush of the persons who would be bringing the payroll money on a particular day. So if you were to engage in an ambush, necessarily you should be at the crime scene earlier than your prey, is it not? Because of what use would you be at the crime scene if they would already have passed? You may wait till eternity, but they would never pass again. So that's precisely what they did. They went there early. While waiting, one of them felt the call of nature. So he had to go to the side and deliver his own message. After that, of course, he had to clean himself up. Luckily for him, he had a paper with him, which he used for that purpose. Then he went back to his place, and in time, the persons that they were waiting for showed up. They fired at them, killing one. Another passenger was able to run away, and the third one was pinned by the motorcycle. But the ambushers were just interested in the money. So they took the money and left. Then, just like in the movies, after the malefactors had left the scene, that was the time that the policemen arrived. So, of course, they had to undertake some investigation. And one of them went around and in time saw what must have been a fresh piece of evidence. So if there's something like that, he must have thought to himself that there must also be something else that went along with it. And in time, he saw the paper. He picked it up. And then carefully unfurled it. Aside from seeing the obvious, he also saw something that provided the police with a lead, a name in that paper. So they looked for that guy, they eventually found him, and then they invited him to the police station. They kept him overnight, they asked him questions, and they got answers in which this guy admitted his participation and also told the police as to where he kept his part of the loot. In time, he and the others were prosecuted and found guilty. When the case reached the Supreme Court, you would expect the Supreme Court to pin a medal on this policeman, especially the one who performed well beyond the smell of duty, right? Instead, the Supreme Court castigated all of them. Why? The Supreme Court said, what you did cannot be considered as lawful arrest. It cannot fall under hot pursuit. The paper could not have provided you with enough basis to effect a warrantless arrest. Why? Because the name in that paper could have been the name of any other person, and the paper was used by somebody else. And moreover, the Supreme Court said, when you invited that person, that was already a form of arrest. Then you started questioning him without giving him his Miranda rights. Therefore, what you did was wrong. Nevertheless, these men were still convicted based on some other evidence, not necessarily the lead from that paper, which incidentally was also marked as exhibit. That paper, for this case, should make you be more careful about your papers, especially after you would have taken the bar. Why? What was that paper all about? Biodata. So be careful about your biodata after you pass the bar, because it might just be used by others for that purpose. And worse, you might get implicated in a crime because of your misplaced biodata. In regard to the exclusionary rule, the Philippines started to adopt it in Stonehill versus Jokno. But it was way back in the 1960s. Before then, the rule was that the fact that the evidence was illegally obtained would not prevent its use in evidence, without prejudice to prosecuting whoever might have been responsible for that unlawful procurement. But in Stonehill, the Supreme Court said that kind of a deterrent is not good enough. It's better to adopt the exclusionary rule. Because if the policemen know that even if they obtain an evidence illegally, it would still be used, they may take chances. And moreover, there's a possibility that they may never be prosecuted at all. Because very likely, when they obtain evidence illegally, it would be in favor of the powers that be. So why would the powers that be, who would benefit from that illegal act, still prosecute the policeman responsible for it? Whereas, if you now adopt the exclusionary rule, if the policemen know that whatever they obtain would be useless, then it's more likely that they will not even attempt to get it. Because aside from the fact that it would be useless, it would be futile, there's still the possibility that they might be prosecuted. So the adoption of the exclusionary rule. Then the 1973 Constitution already incorporated it in the Constitution itself, and this is also replicated in the 1987 Constitution. Relative to the exclusionary rule is the so-called fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. So it's not merely the one that was obtained illegally that will be excluded. It would also extend to whatever might have been discovered as a result of the illegally obtained evidence. If the tree itself is poisoned, then its fruits should similarly be considered as poison and therefore similarly inadmissible. In regard to this provision against unreasonable searches and seizures, you have again to remember that it is essentially tied down to the idea of privacy, especially as related also to the guarantee of right, privacy, and communications. In the United States, there is no counterpart of our Section 3 of the Bill of Rights on the right to privacy and communications. Instead, what the U.S. Supreme Court has used as basis to come up with the same guarantee as we have in Section 3 is the Fourth Amendment, the counterpart of our Section 2. As we have explained earlier, this was originally understood as referring only to physical intrusions. But the Supreme Court, in the case of Katz, has seen that it not only protects against physical intrusion, but it is a protection of the justified expectations of privacy of the people. So, if it falls within the justified expectations of privacy of the people, then it should be free from governmental intrusions, physical or otherwise. But in the Philippines, we have incorporated it as a separate provision. And when it comes to the right to privacy of communications, correspondence and communications, take note of Republic Act 4200. So that law would penalize the secret recording of private communications. In a private communication, everyone must give consent. Otherwise, there would be a violation of that law. And this is exemplified by the case of Ramirez. Ramirez was an employee, and she was summoned to the office of her boss. She somehow anticipated already that she would get berated, shamed, and embarrassed by her boss. So what she did was to secretly bring along a tape recorder. It was still the days of tape recorder. Now you would have those digital recorders, right? And the moment she was inside, she already started to record everything. True to her expectations, her boss started to berate her. You know how women are, you know? Their words are so biting, and their tongues are so much sharper. They really hurt. After that incident, she made use of the transcript of what transpired as basis for charging her boss with damages or for damages. The boss, however, countercharged her with violation of Republic Act 4200. Ramirez said, no, it's not applicable. The Supreme Court said yes, because what you had was a private communication, and the other party to that communication didn't know that you were recording it. Since you did not give consent, then there could be violation of Republic Act 4200. You have to distinguish this, however, from the case of Navarro. In that case, there was an altercation between a radio reporter and a policeman in the police precinct itself. This altercation eventually led to the policeman hitting the radio reporter with the butt of his gun, and that radio reporter falling to the floor, and following more blows from the policeman, that reporter died. So in the prosecution of the policeman, a recording of that altercation was sought to be introduced as evidence against him. He objected because he didn't know there was such a recording. The Supreme Court said Republic Act 4200 would have no application because that communication was not private. It was public. Anybody who would have been at the police station could have heard that altercation. Accordingly, if anybody recorded that altercation, then there is no liability, and that recording could be admitted in evidence. Related to searches and seizures and the privacy of communications and correspondence would of course be the fairly recent rule on writ of habeas data. So this is supposed to be a rule to protect a person's privacy in life, liberty, and security against those government or private persons who make illegal acts in the gathering or storage of data or information about a person, his family, his correspondence, and other aspects of his life. The remedies include deleting the data that might have been collected and stored, or correcting them, or enjoining that illegal activity. I'm not yet aware of any case in which the Supreme Court had already made use of this particular remedy. So the more recent cases are in regard to the writ of amparo. And we'll discuss that when we talk about the writ of habeas corpus. Now let's proceed to the guarantee of freedom of speech, of expression, and of the press. This is a freedom that's considered one of the most cherished, especially when it comes to the American experience. So it is placed in the First Amendment, together with the guarantee of freedom of expression. The fact that it is in the First Amendment may be indicative of how it was in the minds of the framers of the U.S. Constitution. To properly appreciate this freedom, try to think of how you would be if you were more ignorant than what you are now. If you didn't know much, would you be happy? Or perhaps you would be happy because you didn't know that you didn't know anything, right? Still believe in witches? Or did you ever come to think, why is it that people in the provinces believe in witches, but people in the urban areas don't? Is it because witches cannot stay in urban areas? Or it's simply because it all depends on the state of knowledge of the people? The more ignorant you are, the more likely that you are to believe in witches. Like if you don't like the face of an old woman, you might start thinking that she is a witch, isn't it? And if you start getting sick, then you would attribute that to that old woman. When the truth is you're really sick due to some other reasons. When it comes to the freedom of expression, a favorite of mine is a line from the concurring opinion in the case of Whitney versus California. The line says, men feared witches and burnt women. It's a simple line, but it encapsulates a very interesting idea about how ignorance could lead to much problems for everyone. If witches do not really exist, because they are merely the consequence of men's fears, then who did the men end up burning? Innocent women, isn't it? And seeing the sun ray on your shoulder, when did the sun stop revolving around the earth? It never did. It never went around the earth. It has always been the earth going around the sun, isn't it? But once upon a time, it was standard knowledge that it was the sun going around the earth, and to suggest otherwise was dangerous. So you can just imagine, therefore, the value of speech, because it now frees up men and women from the darkness of ignorance. And accordingly, the guarantee of freedom of speech is basically against prior restraint. Because the government do not always know everything. That's good for the people. And moreover, we are supposed to be in a republic. Therefore, it's the people's input that should also make a lot of difference. But the people cannot be expected to have their own contributions if they are kept in the dark, if they're not allowed to express their ideas and exchange it with others. Also, an underlying philosophy behind the freedom of expression is the thought that if you allow the free interplay of ideas in the marketplace, it's more likely to bring out the truth rather than trying to manipulate or filter the information that would reach the people. For freedom of speech, we have that fairly recent case of Chavez versus Gonzalez. This is about the Hello Garci thing. So you very well remember how the government tried to control the flow or the dissemination of the so-called Hello Garci thing, warning people about the possible adverse consequences, particularly violation of Republic Act 4200. Then the DOJ secretary came up with that kind of a warning, particularly addressed to those in the broadcast industry. And this was also coupled by the warning coming from the National Telecommunications Commission. Then because of this, Chavez, who is not himself a broadcast practitioner, came forward and went to the Supreme Court asking the court to declare what the DOJ Secretary and the NTC did as prior restraint. In the case of Chavez, the Supreme Court said that this is the first time that the Supreme Court is confronted with the issue as to whether what the government did constituted prior restraint or not. Because the past cases simply dealt with the issue as to whether what the government did, the regulation that it issued, whether it fell within the allowable limits or not. But this time, the court is being asked to determine whether what the DOJ Secretary and the NTC did, whether they constituted prior restraint. And the Supreme Court came up with the conclusion that yes, they did. And prior restraint means that the regulation or the act of the government is presumptively unconstitutional. So why is it so important to prevent a prior restraint? Again, because of the philosophy that the people should, as much as possible, be given a chance to know something and for them to evaluate and discuss among themselves, because they could better determine what's good for the country if they knew things of this nature, instead of being simply told by the government what they should hear. Just remember what happened in Iran when the students and the populace started to somehow make trouble for the government. What the government did was to control the press, is it not? Control the flow of information. And in that way, since the people didn't know what the others would be doing, then they could not likely do more. They could not coordinate their actions. And they could be isolated such that they could not have a coordinated action. And that would serve best the interest of the government. If the opposition is divided or not well organized, then it would be easier for the government to control them. But that is not the essence of a republic. It is not for the government to control the people. It is supposed to be the people determining for the government what it should be doing. In the case of Chavez, the Supreme Court said that you have to make a determination as to whether a regulation is content-based or content-neutral. What difference would it make? A content-based regulation is presumptively unconstitutional. On the other hand, a content-neutral regulation is generally considered constitutional. So there is a bias against content-based regulation. And the reason again for that is, in a content-based regulation, the government now tries to determine what message to allow, and that would be dependent on the content of the message. So it may happen that if the message is against the government, then the government would not allow it. But if it is for the government, then it would allow it. But that would then be manipulating things. And again, that would be contrary to the very idea of a Republican state where you have this freedom of expression. So, as a general rule, the people should know and let them decide. It is not for the government to tell them what to hear, what to see, or what to listen to. Let them make their own decisions. In a content-neutral regulation, what happens is the government has these regulations, particularly about conduct, which, however, would have some implication also on speech. But speech is not the main concern of the regulations. An example for this would be BP 880, which was the subject matter in the case of Bayan versus Ermita. So under BP 880, or the Public Assembly Act of 1985, there are certain rules governing the holding of public assemblies. Bayan claimed that BP 880 is content-based. The Supreme Court said no, it is content-neutral. Content-neutral because no matter what the message is, the same set of regulations would apply. Whether you are holding a rally for the government or against the government, it's still the same regulations. So again, basically, the guarantee of freedom of speech and of the press is against prior restraint, as well as a limitation on subsequent punishment. In the case of Chavez, this was highlighted. While the dissemination of the contents of the Hello Garcia tape may not be restrained, because that would be something that cannot be considered valid under the freedom of speech or of the press, it does not prevent the possibility of subsequent punishment if, in the exercise of this right to disseminate, a crime might have been committed. But the point is, at least the people would already have been informed, so it's up to them to make up their own decisions. Let the information flow, and the possibility of subsequent punishment would be dealt with later if warranted. To highlight the value of freedom of speech, there are certain special rules applicable to speech cases. So aside from the content-based and content-neutral distinctions, we also have this so-called facial challenge and the overbreadth doctrine. So under the overbreadth doctrine, even as the state may have the right to regulate a particular act, it may not do it in a manner that would sweep broadly and thereby affect or impair other constitutionally protected rights. So if you have such a law, it may have a valid purpose. It may be applied to a particular situation, but because of its broadness, it would now have the tendency to also restrain or prohibit even protected speech, in which case the law itself may have to be invalidated for the sake of protecting these speeches, even if at the sacrifice of having to allow a particular illegal act to go on in the meantime. And you couple this with facial challenge. The normal way by which a party can assail an unconstitutional law is to challenge only those provisions that have particular application to him. So if the law, for instance, has 50 sections, and it's only section 50 that affects him, then he can only challenge that particular section. Even if sections 10 to 49 are also unconstitutional insofar as he thinks they are. Since they do not affect him, then he has no business trying to challenge them. That's the as-applied challenge. But if that law happens to be one impairing the freedom of speech, even if the only particular provision that affects him is section 50, and even assuming that section 50 may be validly applied to him, but sections 10 to 49 are unconstitutionally applied, or in his view they are overbroad, then he can also challenge them. That is the facial challenge, because in that case the law on its face would appear to be unconstitutional. So what is the justification for allowing facial challenges? The justification is again rooted on the value of speech. If you allow those laws or those provisions to remain in the meantime, then it's very likely that it would suppress the ability of others to express themselves. While those provisions are in the statute books, some persons may be inhibited, may be perhaps threatened with possible persecution or prosecution, and would rather keep quiet rather than try to challenge those provisions by engaging in the kind of conduct that would invite prosecution. So you might have a bright idea, but you think that that would be contrary to the law. So if you came up with your idea, you run the risk of getting prosecuted. So you would rather keep quiet. In the meantime, whatever bright ideas you would have would remain with you and would never be shared with the people. Whereas, if you shared your ideas with the people, then everyone might benefit. So, to avoid this situation from occurring, facial challenge is allowed when it comes to free speech cases, to free the people as soon as possible from the fear that they may be prosecuted for violating the law. Because by having the law challenged as soon as possible, and the courts possibly deciding as soon as possible also as whether they are valid or not, so much the better for everyone. Like in the case, again, of Chavez. Chavez himself was not a broadcast practitioner, but the warnings coming from the DOJ Secretary and the NTC were basically directed to broadcast practitioners. You would then think that, of course, the persons directly affected are broadcast practitioners, so they should be the ones with the personality to challenge what Gonzalez and the NTC did. But they did not. As a matter of fact, they simply acquiesced in these warnings. So if Chavez did not come along, if an outsider did not bring the case before the Supreme Court, then the people would still be under that kind of a regime where the government tells them you cannot hear the tapes. But with the decision of the Supreme Court in Chavez, thanks to an outsider, that could be considered as a form of facial challenge, which now frees up a lot. which now gives the people a chance to hear the tape if they would still be interested. But please, whether they're interested or not, you have a definitive ruling regarding the extent to which the government can regulate the information or the news that may reach them. While the general rule is that there could be no prior restraint, it does not necessarily mean, however, that the state cannot require prior submission of pre-recorded work or review and classification by the appropriate state agency, like the MTRCB. The Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld the power and authority of the MTRCB to require prior submission of pre-recorded work before they are broadcast. In the old case of Iglesia ni Cristo, the Supreme Court said, even in spite of the claim of Iglesia ni Cristo to freedom of religion, the Supreme Court still sustained the power of the MTRCB to require Iglesia ni Cristo to submit to it its pre-recorded segments of its programs before they are broadcast. This was subsequently reiterated in the case of ABS-CBN regarding a practice of certain students of trying to raise funds for their tuition fees. It so happens that this is frowned upon by most of society. Anyway, Inside Story came up with an episode about this practice, and which it appropriately titled Cross the Tuition. So you now have an idea as to what the students are doing. In that episode, several students, faculty members, and other individuals were interviewed. And prominent in the background was Philippine Women's University. So what could that only mean? That if you want that kind of a service, then perhaps it would be easy to get one from PWU, right? Of course, PWU felt offended, and it filed a case against ABS-CBN before the MTRCB, and the MTRCB fined ABS-CBN. ABS-CBN complained, brought it up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, if in the case of Iglesia ni Cristo, invoking religious freedom, we still sustain the authority of the MTRCB, how much more when you are only invoking freedom of the press? In that case, the Supreme Court gave the impression that in case there was a conflict between freedom of religion and freedom of the press, freedom of religion may have to prevail, because it seems to have more weight compared to freedom of the press. But if you read other cases, there is no suggestion that freedom of the press is of a lower level compared to freedom of religion. So we just have to wait and see how this may happen in case there's really a conflict between freedom of religion and freedom of the press. Just remember those controversies in the Scandinavian countries before regarding the caricature of Muhammad. To the Muslims, the visual representation of the Prophet is a no-no. And yet, there were some cartoonists in the Scandinavian countries who came up with caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad. And they were not even flattering. In one such caricature, for instance, the Prophet was shown as having a turban which was topped by a bomb that's already about to explode. So that could be derogatory to the Muslims. And there was an issue as to whether this could be published, despite the fact that the Muslims were complaining against it. So there was a conflict between religious freedom and press freedom. But in those Scandinavian countries, they sustained press freedom and let the newspapers publish without any restrictions, in spite of the threat of violent reactions coming from the Muslims. You never saw perhaps any of these caricatures, but if you were looking at the internet, there were some sites showing these caricatures. So if that were to happen in the Philippines, how would the courts likely resolve the issue? We'll just wait and see. Anyway, the Supreme Court keeps on changing its membership. So what some may have said before may no longer be the current view among the newer members. In GMA versus MTRCB, the principle of requiring again prior submission to the MTRCB was upheld. In this case, a sister television station of Channel 7, belonging also to GMA, aired a documentary, The Making of Moro Ami. This was not previously cleared with the MTRCB. So what the MTRCB did was to penalize GMA with suspension of the broadcast of that sister corporation for 1 week. GMA complied, but just the same, it elevated the case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court sustained the authority of the MTRCB. Nevertheless, it also asked GMA, why did you comply with that penalty? So why should GMA not comply with the penalty? If the MTRCB had the authority, then it should follow that it would also have the power to penalize GMA. The Supreme Court said, yes, MTRCB has the power. However, you have to take note of the fact that you were penalized in accordance with the rules of the MTRCB, which have not yet been filed with the Office of the National Administrative Register. That is a requirement for effectivity. Therefore, at the time when you committed that offense, at the time when you were penalized by MTRCB, the rules under which you were supposed to have been penalized were not yet operational because they have not yet been submitted with the Office of the National Administrative Register, or ONR, with the UP Law Center. So it's not enough that there be publication. There must also be filing with ONR. One of the recognized exceptions to the freedom of expression would be obscenity. The problem with that is determining what is obscene from what is art. So how do you draw the line? That is not an easy task, and it has exercised the U.S. Supreme Court for a long time until it came up with its guidelines in the case of Miller versus California. So in that case, the Supreme Court said that there are 3 questions to be asked. 1, whether an ordinary individual or average individual taking the work as a whole and making use of contemporary community standards would find that the work appeals to purely prurient interest. 2, whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive manner sexual conduct as defined by the appropriate state law. And finally, whether the work taken as a whole lacks any serious artistic, literary, political, or scientific value. You may have the guidelines, but still, there will remain to be some difficulty. Take note that the Supreme Court made use of contemporary community standards. So it's not a national standard because the standards could vary from place to place. What may be artistic for people in Manila, for instance, and urban area, would be considered as obscene in the rural conservative areas. The same way in the U.S. There are areas which will be more conservative than others. And you have to consider the work as a whole, because if you just take it in parts, then they may appear to be obscene. But if you see them as part of a greater whole, then you would see how they fit in. And regarding serious artistic, literary, political, or scientific value, even something that others may find to be pornographic may have scientific value for men past their prime. In regard to mere possession of pornographic material, the Supreme Court of the U.S. has said that that cannot be criminalized because it is not the business of the state to be dictating upon its citizens what to read, hear, or see. It is up to them to determine by their own judgments. However, when it comes to child pornographic materials, that is an entirely different thing. You might have read every now and then about police in other states confiscating hard disks. And the reason for that is they suspect them as containing downloaded child pornographic materials. So what would be more private than your computer? But still, this could be confiscated by the police authorities. And the reason for that is mere possession of child pornographic materials could be criminalized. Why is that? It is part of the state's solicitousness for the welfare of children. They have to protect the interests of children. If adults participate in the creation of pornographic materials, then that's their lookout. They know more or less what would be the consequences. However, if children are made to participate in child pornographic materials, then that would become a permanent emotional wound in their lives. They do not know much and they would be exploited by others. So to properly protect the children, you can prohibit the creation of child pornographic materials. But that may not be enough. For as long as there is a market for these materials, then others may still take chances in producing these materials. However, if you now criminalize mere possession of child pornographic materials, then it may dry up the market. So if nobody would now be buying, because it's also a crime to own, then those who used to produce these child pornographic materials may decide to stop altogether. So when they stop, then they would also stop exploiting children. Insofar as libel is concerned, it is also considered as an exception. While you may have the right to speak your mind, you do not have the same liberty to damage the reputation of your neighbor. Take note, however, that when it comes to libel, there is a difference between those public figures or public officials and private individuals. Insofar as the standard that they have to satisfy in order to recover. For public officials and public figures, you have the so-called New York Times test or the actual malice test. So the publication must have been made with the actual knowledge that it is false or with reckless disregard as to whether it was true or false. Mere inaccuracy or the mere fact that it might not be true, if there's no actual malice, would not enable the public official or the public figure who might have felt maligned. The reason given for this is, again, the fact that public officials are supposed to be accountable to the people. They have to do things for the public. Therefore, they are fair game for the public in criticizing them or saying some other things that may not sit well with them. But that's the price that they have to pay for being in public office. For public figures, they may not be public officials, but they're also similarly in the public limelight because of their status in life, their achievements perhaps, or some other events that might have somehow focused the light on them. So since they are in that situation, then they cannot complain in the same way that a private individual can if he feels having been maligned. In the case of Binay versus Secretary of Justice, we have here a news account regarding an adopted daughter of Binay. By the way, how much are panties? The panties that are normally bought by ordinary, let's say, working girls. How much would they be? Around Somebody once told me before that they can go to the Visoria and buy panties worth 3 per 100, but they become itchy. So how much are the panties that are ordinarily bought by the working women, for instance? So they cost around 1,000? Or that's already too high? Especially if they were bought way back in the 1990s. In the case of Binay, the story is about an adopted daughter of his who was allegedly buying panties worth 1,000. Binay felt offended. At that time, he was no longer the mayor of Makati because he had already served 3 terms. But the mayor then was the wife. The DOJ dismissed the case, saying that there was no probable cause. The Supreme Court disagreed. The Supreme Court said that there is no legal nor social and moral duty on the part of the one who published to highlight the fact that the daughter was adopted. And there's no legal or there's no public interest respecting her purchases of panties worth 1,000 pesos. Insofar as the first part is concerned, I may have no problem. But with the second part, I have some reservations. You're dealing here with the daughter of a former public official. And if her purchases of what she needs are not those ordinarily bought by others, is that not likely to raise eyebrows? So that you can now start asking, for instance, where did the money come from? Was it part of the legitimate income of the father or some other sources? Is that not precisely the reason why there are laws against unexplained wealth? So, if the point is to make people start thinking, should that be actionable? What kind of operation is this? If you were at Balete Drive, then perhaps you would start scaring the people. Next time, you just wear white. Tomorrow.
No.
Let us be. Afraid that will make suppression.
Anyway, as I said, I don't agree, particularly with that second part, that the people have no interest respecting that daughter's purchases of panties worth 1,000 pesos. If she was merely the daughter of an ordinary private person, no problem. But here, she was the daughter of a former public official, and who at that time was also the daughter of the present mayor of Makati. What happens if he now wins the vice presidency?
Ano na lang ba kung sa bata?
Turban.
Now let's talk about airlines. Japan Airlines versus Simangan. Simangan was supposed to go to the States to donate one of his organs to a relative who was having an operation. And for that purpose, he was given a special
Passport.
travel document by the U.S. Embassy. He was already seated at the Japan Airlines plane when he was forced out by the personnel of JAL because they were not familiar with the document that he presented, and they had doubts whether the same could really be used for traveling purposes. So Simangan was not able to go to the States, and he was not also able to donate his organ, and subsequently he filed the case against Japan Airlines. The fact of filing this case was reported in the papers. When Japan Airlines came up with its answer, it included as a counterclaim this alleged damage to its goodwill because of that newspaper account, and which it attributed to Simangan. The Supreme Court said there was no sufficient proof that it came from Simangan. And even if it came from Simangan, that would still not be actionable, because Japan Airlines could be considered as a public figure, and what was reported was a matter of public concern. So that is not something that could possibly be a basis for a claim for damages or a counterclaim. There was no actual malice. In regard to speech and elections, you have those previous cases regarding the conduct of survey results, and which is relevant because of what Gordon has filed, isn't it? He's claiming damages because of the manner these surveys are conducted. Anyway, one before was the case of ABS-CBN regarding the conduct of exit polls, and the Supreme Court sustained the right of ABS-CBN to conduct this, saying that in the absence of a clear and present danger, then you cannot prevent conduct of these exit polls, no matter that there may be allegations that they would tend to undermine the integrity of the electoral process. That was also repeated in the case of social weather stations regarding the prohibition on the publication of the results of surveys 7 days before local elections or 15 days before national elections. Again, the Supreme Court sustained the right to publish in the absence of a clear and present danger. Take note of what Chief Justice Pono came up with in the case of Pharmaceutical and Healthcare Association of the Philippines versus DOCE. This has something to do with the milk code. So the main decision said that the DOH cannot adopt as part of the revised implementing rules and regulations an absolute ban on the advertisement of breast milk substitutes because this is not found in the milk code itself. So if it's not in the law, then the administrative agency cannot supply the missing parts through implementing rules. What is interesting, however, is the separate concurring opinion of Chief Justice Pono regarding his view on commercial speech or transactions that propose an economic activity. According to him, viewed from that angle, that provision of the revised implementing rules and regulations providing for absolute ban on breast milk substitute advertisements would be against the guarantee of freedom of speech extending to commercial speech. It used to be in the U.S. that commercial speech is not considered within the coverage of the freedom of speech. So it would extend, for instance, to political debate, but not to commercial advertisements. However, the U.S. Supreme Court subsequently changed its views. And they started with a case of advertisement involving pharmacists. Pharmacists, just like lawyers, also have a code of ethics which prohibits advertising. But some pharmacists started to advertise, so they were made to respond to violations of or charges regarding violations of their code of ethics. And this reached the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said this is covered by the guarantee of freedom of speech. While the core speech that is governed, that is protected by the guarantee, would refer to political speech, there is no reason why it should not also be extended to commercial speech. As a matter of fact, for many people, that might even be more meaningful compared to political speech. They may not be as interested to debate about the affairs of government, but they would be interested to find out where they would get the best bargains, since this would deal with their pocketbooks, especially if they only have limited resources. So if they could compare, for instance, prices, then it would be best for them. That would be to their interest. So that began the Supreme Court decisions regarding providing also the freedom of speech to commercial speech. And this has been extended also to a limited amount of lawyer advertising, as exemplified by the case of Bates versus State Bar of Arizona. In the Philippines, of course, we haven't gone that far. But with what the Chief Justice did in the case of Pharmaceutical and Healthcare Association of the Philippines, in time, some more progressive minds might extend it to also allow for more liberalized advertising. I have a nagging suspicion that the advertisements in the U.S., if you try to see magazines coming from the U.S., you would notice that when they compare products, they name names. In the Philippines, the only name that you have would be the one advertising, and all the others would be referred to as XYC, or ABC. So perhaps that is the result of the recognition of the right to freedom of speech when it comes to commercial transactions. So in the case of pharmaceutical and healthcare, the Chief Justice said that if a commercial speech is truthful, it's not misleading, then it cannot be banned unless it can be shown that the government regulation promotes a substantial government interest. And that regulation would be no more extensive than is necessary for that purpose. In the case of the revised implementing rules and regulations of the DOH, the Chief Justice found them to be more than necessary to achieve the objective that the government might have. Therefore, it cannot stand constitutional scrutiny. When your right or your freedom of speech is violated, you have to run to the courts. What if the courts themselves are also very sensitive about their own dignity, their standing, and their self-respect, such that they would not easily accept criticism? Like, they might feel that whenever you criticize them, you are bringing down a sacred institution. A particular case that until now I have a hard time trying to understand is a case of social weather stations versus Asuncion. This has something to do with a survey conducted by social weather stations regarding the degree of confidence that people had in the different government institutions. When the survey results came in, it turned out that the people had more trust in the PNP compared to the judiciary. So this alarmed Judge Asuncion, who was then a judge at a branch of the RTC in Quezon City. What he did was to require social weather stations to explain why it should not be cited in contempt for having circulated or having that published, and social weather stations complied in due time. It explained that it was the one responsible for the conduct of that survey, but it was not the one who gave it to the papers. Social weather stations said it gave a copy to the government, so somebody else in the government might have been the one who fed that to the press. With that explanation, Judge Asuncion already lifted the show cause order. Nevertheless, the social weather stations still went up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said the show cause order had already been lifted. So it's moot. But even if it was not, we cannot blame Judge Asuncion for what he did. Because at that time, the reputation of the judiciary was at a low ebb. And there were a lot of criticism. There were a lot of allegations about corrupt judges and so on. So it's only to be expected that he would undertake to protect the image of the judiciary. Okay, even assuming that Judge Asuncion had the right to do that, but was it proper for him to be making SWS account? Is it not something like killing the messenger because you don't like the message? Is it the fault of social weather stations if the Filipino people felt that way? Okay, let's now say that it's over. let's assume that SWS would again conduct the same kind of survey. And let's assume that this time the results are worse. The judiciary is now at the bottom of the heap. So what would prevent all or some other judges all over the Philippines from following the lead of Judge Asuncion? So these judges, as far as Tuguegarao, Lawag, Cabanatuan, Lucena, Cebu, Davao, Pulo, they would all now come up with similar orders for SWS to explain. Let's assume that SWS would be able to explain and satisfy all of these judges. But at what cost? SWS would now have spread its resources thin all over the archipelago, trying to defend something that in the first place it should not even be made to defend, isn't it? Or explain. Because it is merely doing its job, and it's merely trying to gather or determine the pulse of the people. So if this were to happen, it could have a chilling effect on SWS. It would not do it again, not because it is wrong, but because it is too costly. Not because it is wrong, but because it is already impractical for it. So if that were to happen, who would be the ultimate losers? Would it not be the people? Because by then they would not know what the rest of the country might be thinking about their institutions. And if the people were not to know that, their ignorance would only lead to worse consequences. Because perhaps the courts would now feel comfortable in the idea that the people really trust them, when in fact they don't. So as I said, I, until now, have a hard time understanding this case. We now have 3 justices who came from, or who were associated with us. I don't know if they will ever have an opportunity to decide a case like this in the future. In regard to the censorship of the internet, you have that case of Reno versus American Civil Liberties Union. Here, the U.S. Congress tried to regulate communications in the internet because of the possible adverse consequences to children. You very well know that the internet is a very rich resource. It could be a vast library, but it could also be a fertile ground for some things that you may rather not have. So you would have sites for pornography. You would have viruses. So what the U.S. Congress did is to pass the Communications Decency Act. According to that law, it would penalize communications over the internet using patently offensive or indecent language if there were children in that communication. Anything wrong with that? The U.S. Supreme Court said yes. It suffers from overbreadth. In trying to protect the interests of children, Congress is practically forcing adults to make use of language that is only appropriate for children. So it now prevents them from using the kind of language that is normal to them. That therefore affects their freedom of speech. So you cannot try to advance the interests of children at the expense of adults in that manner. Now let's talk about heckler's veto. You very well know that the heckler tries to prevent the speaker from delivering his message. So in legal contemplation, what is a heckler's veto? A heckler's veto may come about if a particular regulation, while trying to ostensibly protect the speaker, would actually suppress the ability of the speaker to deliver his message because of what are incorporated in that regulation. The regulation may appear on its face to prevent those opposed to the speech from preventing the speaker from saying his piece. But in the end, it would have the effect of actually preventing the message from being conveyed. How would that happen? Let's say that there is a regulation which requires the payment of a permit fee if one were to hold a rally. The permit fee is computed on the need for keeping order at the rally site. So that translates to the presence of policemen. And the number of policemen would depend on the anticipated opposition, if ever any. So let's say 10,000 plan to hold the rally, which is, however, not opposed by anyone. For that, you may only need 5 policemen to be around. So the permit fee would be based on the presence of 5 policemen. What if, let's say, 100 would also plan a rally? Their ideas, however, are radical, and much of the community would be expected to appear and show their displeasure or even opposition to that rally. So there may only be 100 showing up, but it is expected that there will be 5,000 from that community who would show up and threaten the rallists. Therefore, there might be a need for also 100 policemen to be present. But if you need 100 policemen, then the permit fee would be similarly adjusted, meaning it would be so much higher than the permit fee for those 10,000. Because the permit fee would be so much higher, the 100 may not be able to pay to afford that fee. So since they could not afford the fee, then they would not be able to hold the rally after all. So in effect, the hecklers, those who were opposed to the message, would have prevailed. They would have prevented the speaker from delivering the message. Heckler's veto. Anyway, don't worry. Perhaps that will never be us. It's just for mental exercise. In the case of EDSA 2, the Supreme Court had said in the case of Estrada that that was an exercise of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. So take note that under the provision on freedom of expression, you also have that provision on the right of the people to peaceably assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. Because that is also a form of expression. You congregate, but you can show your force, and thereafter come up with a voice that could be better heard. On freedom of religion, this basically consists of 2 sub-parts: the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. We don't have much of a problem when it comes to the Establishment Clause. Perhaps it's because we are predominantly of a particular religion only. But in the US, they have a lot of problems about this, especially that there are so many religions. Anyway, the Establishment Clause is a prescription for the government to maintain neutrality among religions. At the same time, it's also a neutrality between those who believe from those who don't believe. Because religion is such a contentious issue. And it's quite ironic that even as religion is supposed to be about the more noble qualities of men, it has also led to much bloodshed. If it were as simple as trying to get a correct answer, then perhaps you would not have much of a problem, you know. But as you can very well see, it is not that simple. Because if it were that simple, then you would just simply ask, what's the religion of God anyway? If you can now find the religion of God, then that should be the true religion, you know. But obviously, you cannot do that. So for the government to have a part in debates like this would only be self-defeating. The government is not equipped to deal with this. As a matter of fact, you cannot prove religion through the rules of evidence. If you can do that, then many would already have done in the past. In the Philippines, we have that old case of Aglipay versus Luis. Here, the head of the Philippine Independent Church, Aglipay, questioned the issuance of a postage stamp that commemorated the holding of an international Catholic event in the Philippines. To him, this was a violation of the separation of church and state because the government was promoting the Catholic religion. But the Supreme Court said, no, it's not. It was not for the Catholic religion. It was a means of calling attention to the fact that there is such a group of islands in the Far East named Philippines. So it's more like advertising the Philippines instead of promoting the Catholic Church. Mention of the Catholic event here was precisely for that purpose, to call attention to the fact that there was this international event involving Catholics and which was held in the Philippines. And moreover, the Supreme Court said, here, the money redounded to the benefit of the government, not the Catholic Church. In regard to the free exercise clause, that's where we have a little more problems, more cases. Of particular relevance is in relation to the Jehovah's Witnesses with regard to the flag ceremony cases. It used to be, like in the case of Herod, that if the children of the Jehovah's Witnesses wanted to avail of public education, then they must comply with the regulations, including having to attend the flag ceremony. So this was the ruling of the court even in the face of the objections of the Jehovah's Witnesses, because this would be contrary to their idea of religion. Like they would now be venerating something other than their Jehovah. But the court said, if you want to be in school, then you have to follow the rules. Subsequently, after about 30 years, the Supreme Court changed its mind. And in the case of Ebralinak, it now said, okay, it would be too much for you to sacrifice your religious beliefs and practices just for the state to inculcate discipline and patriotism. Not much is lost if you were to be exempted. So now, the new rule, if it is contrary to their religious beliefs, then they could not be forced to participate in the flag ceremony. In regard to Muslims you have that request of the Muslim court employees in Iligan City. Muslims during the Ramadan do not eat nor drink from sunrise to sunset. It should be good for the future, right? So they asked the court that they be allowed to adjust their office hours. Like what? They report early in the morning, 7:30, continually work from then until 3:30, and they should be allowed to go home. So they would not have any coffee breaks or lunch breaks. Since they do not drink, they do not eat, then there's no point having those kinds of breaks. So they might as well just be considered to be continually working from the time they went in until they should go home, which should be earlier than the rest. The Supreme Court said no problem. There is a presidential decree that recognizes Muslim holidays, and this could be utilized as basis for granting your request. Then they also requested that their office hours during all Fridays of the year should also be adjusted, because Fridays would be their prayer days. So they wanted that they be allowed to go out at 10 and then go back at around 2 o'clock to perform their Friday prayers. The Supreme Court said, sorry, we cannot grant you that. Otherwise, you would now be considered as a favored class, because you would now be rendering office hours less than the prescribed 40-hour work week. And moreover, there is no law that allows you that privilege. So insofar as the office hours during the Ramadan are concerned, it's okay. But for the adjustment of all their Friday hours, that's a different story. Another case involving the Muslims would be the case of Islamic Dawah Council of the Philippines. In this case, Malacanang came up with an executive order which mandated the Office of Muslim Affairs as the office to issue halal certification. So halal certification would signify as to whether a particular food is fit for the Muslims to take. Islamic Dawah Council, an organization of Muslims, protested this government measure. The Supreme Court said halal certification means that you have to determine whether a particular food is fit for the Muslims or not. And for that purpose, you have to read the Quran as to what would be the requirements. Reading the Quran for the Muslims is not a government function. That is a religious activity. Therefore, the government has no business undertaking halal certification. Halal certification must be done by the Muslims themselves. It is part of their religion. So the Supreme Court said, get out of that halal certification. When it comes to conflicts or disputes within religions, the same may either be purely internal or something that may involve the participation or intervention already of government authorities. So if it's purely internal, like disciplinary measures, doctrines, or dogmas, then that's for them. Like in the case of De La Cruz versus Larocque, it has something to do with excommunication of certain members. The Supreme Court said, we don't have any business with that. So if you were excommunicated by your religious leaders, then the courts cannot come in to afford you any relief. Can you just imagine what would happen if the Supreme Court would now say, reinstate these persons into your religion. But take note of the case of Austria. Do you have any Seventh-day Adventists there? In the case of Austria, he was a Seventh-day Adventist minister. He had some disagreements with his bishop until eventually he got kicked out. So he went to the labor arbiter and filed a case for illegal dismissal. The case went up to the Supreme Court, and an issue that was raised had something to do with the jurisdiction of secular courts over that dispute. The Supreme Court said, you raised that issue late. So you are now, in effect, astute. And even if you were not astute, it appears that you consider your ministers as mere employees. Like in the case of Austria, you reported him to the SSS as an employee. When you dismissed him, you also reported his dismissal to the Department of Labor and Employment. And then, when the case for illegal dismissal was filed against you before the labor arbiter, you did not raise the issue of lack of jurisdiction. So it appears all along that your ministers are merely employees. Therefore, a case for illegal dismissal that they may file would properly fall within the jurisdiction of the labor arbiter and eventually the Supreme Court. So perhaps it's really the case when it comes to Seventh-day Adventists. I have asked some Seventh-day Adventists in the past whether this is true or not, and they said yes. They consider their ministers as employees. So the decision of the court here should not be taken as authority also when it comes to Catholic priests, because they're not considered, I think, as employees. Can you now imagine the NLRC ordering, for instance, the bishop or the cardinal of Manila to reinstate a particular priest in a parish? What if it was the parishioners who already advised the cardinal to remove him because they didn't like him? So can he now complain that because he was denied due process, he was not properly apprised of the charges, and even if he was apprised of the charges, those charges are false? So the NLRC would now order his reinstatement. He says Mass, and the only one present would be the empty air. What kind of religion would you have? So I think the case of Austria is somehow typical only for the Seventh-day Adventists. Now let's talk about love. So for those who may never have been in love, then you can just share from the ideas of others. I remember once when I was lecturing before in Tacloban, there was somebody who came in late, and when she sat down, she made the sign of the cross. I said, why? Have you seen the devil? And that was the last time I saw her. So don't give me the sign of the cross. I'm not a vampire. To what extent would you defy the mores of society for the sake of love? That is the question that you might as well ask in the case of Estrada versus Escritor. Escritor is a court employee, I think an interpreter in one of the courts in Las Piñas. She was charged with immorality because it was alleged that she was living in with a married man who was not her husband. So both were married, but they were married to different spouses, and yet they were cohabiting. And as a matter of fact, out of that union, they already have a child. So, Escritor was made to explain. And he said, it's true. We are members of Jehovah's Witnesses. I was married, but my husband has already died. I'm living in with a man who is also married. The wife is still alive. We started our conjugal arrangement even at the time when my husband was still alive. However, she said, that is an arrangement that is allowed under our religion. It is something sanctioned by the church elders, and it is recognized by Jehovah. I and the man that I'm living in have executed a declaration of pledging faithfulness, where we promise to love one another. It's so hard to imagine, right? And we also undertook to legalize our arrangement in accordance with civil law if the legal impediments would already have been removed. But since it's only my husband who has died in the meantime, then we cannot do that. What did the Supreme Court do? In a majority opinion written by then Justice Pono, he came up with an extended survey of religion through the years, through ages. From the time when religion was practically something like magic, when priests were considered in the nature of magicians, the time when Christianity showed up in the horizon. Then he discussed the time when the first Christians went to Rome and were persecuted, fed to the lions and so on. Then the Christians gained ascendancy in Rome, and that was the time when they also started persecuting the pagans. After that, he also talked about the splits in the church, the Lutheran movement, the Protestants, and so on. He also spoke about the persecutions of minority religious groups, and which led some of them to cross the Atlantic in order to plant their colonies in a new land, the Americas. Thus, when the Americans came up with their own system of government, when they had a chance to write a constitution, among the first that they included was the guarantee of religious freedom. From there, Justice Pono surveyed the American Supreme Court decisions regarding the religion clause. Then he also spoke about how the guarantee of religious freedom crossed the Pacific in order to be implanted in the Philippines. So we have traces of it found now in the 1987 Constitution. It was part also of the 1973 Constitution and the 1935 Constitution. From there, he surveyed the Supreme Court decisions, the Philippine Supreme Court decisions on religion. At the end, he came up with the conclusion that in the Philippines, we have adopted a benevolent neutrality approach that bends backwards to accommodate religious beliefs and practices. So in order to overcome this, there must be a compelling state interest. After about 150 pages of discussions, you now expect Justice Pono to decide whether Escritor should stay or not. He did not do that. Instead, he said that the case should be referred to the office of the court administrator. What for? In order to enable the Solicitor General to enter his appearance. So why do you need the Solicitor General?
Kung may public interest.
Because the Solicitor General would be tasked with the duty of determining the centrality and sincerity of the certain religious belief and practices of a scriptor. Then, he would also be given a chance to introduce, if any, a compelling state interest that may be sufficient to overcome the certain religious practice of a scriptor. And finally, in order to show that whatever is adopted would be the least burdensome on the religious freedom of a scriptor. That was in 2003, the year he took up law, right? No? It's a problem with being old. I tend to forget my numbers. So when did you enter law? 2000? In 2006, the case went back to the Supreme Court. And the majority opinion was again written by Justice Puno. So what he did was to recapitulate what he already said in the first part. And then he applied the parameters in the dispositive portion of the 2003 decision to the facts of the case, and came up with the conclusion that the Solicitor General was unable to introduce a compelling state interest. Therefore, a scriptor cannot be made to give up that conjugal arrangement that he had with the married man that he has been living in for so long. Because this is something that is sanctioned by her religion. So if anything, that could only illustrate how important the religious freedom is. Now let's talk about elections. Anybody here from Davao? And here again, you have a case, a brainchild of that old man. Velarde versus Social Justice Society. You must really be very wealthy with cases like this. You are well aware of the influence of religious leaders on Philippine elections. And Attorney Alcantara had been concerned about this for some time until he decided to finally file a case with the RTC in 2003. I think that was January of 2003. The basic issue is whether endorsement of political leaders by religious leaders constitutes a violation of the separation of church and state. So for that, he cited the case, or the cases, for instance, of Cardinal Sin, Mike Velarde, Iglesia ni Cristo, and so on. That all of these have somehow influenced the political field. Fortunately or unfortunately for him, this case was travelled to a judge who appeared to be more interested and more enthusiastic about it than Attorney Alcantara himself. So why do we say that? Because the judge no longer required the defendants to answer. To her, it was just a simple legal question. So what she did was to require everyone to submit its memorandum explaining its position as to whether that kind of a practice violates the separation of church and state. And after the parties had submitted theirs, she came up with a decision, which she dated June 12, 2003. So at that time, June 12 was still a fixed date for Independence Day. So theoretically, no office. Yet, she dated it that particular date. Perhaps it was symbolic of the independence that she thought she was trying to uphold. In that decision of hers, she said in the middle of it that that practice violates the guarantee of separation of church and state. Then she went on to discuss until she reached the end, in which she only had the word "so ordered," no dispositive portion. When this was brought to her attention, she said that there was no need for a dispositive portion because the action is one for declaratory relief. So there is nothing coercive in it. The court is not going to tell anybody what to do. It's just a declaration for everyone as to what their rights or obligations are, or what the Constitution says. But no action to be expected from anyone. So no need for a dispositive portion. So radical thinking. Following this, Iglesia ni Cristo appealed to the Court of Appeals, while Mike Velarde brought it up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court called for oral argument in April 2004. And the old man had to appear and argue. The oral argument was scheduled at 11, and he was done at I think around 1:30. Other parties were also questioned, and the proceedings were finished shortly before 4 o'clock. So that was April of 2004. Within a month and before the elections, the Supreme Court came up with its decision. It had nothing to do with the merits of the issue raised. The Supreme Court acknowledged that the issue raised was indeed a very interesting constitutional question. But the Supreme Court said, we cannot decide a case when there are no facts which have been proven. Why? Because the issues have never been met or have never been joined. Why? Because the defendants were never made to answer. They were instead asked to submit their memoranda. So, on record, you have nothing about the facts. There was no trial, and there were no admissions. You only have the allegations in the complaint. So how would that now provide enough basis for the Supreme Court to decide a very important constitutional issue? What the court simply did was to discuss more the remedial law aspects of the case, like the problems with the decision of the judge. The Supreme Court said it's wrong for the judge to come up with the judgment without a dispositive portion. Because the dispositive portion is precisely that part of the decision that would now tell the parties how the case was decided. You cannot come up with some declaration in the middle of the decision and now claim that that is a disposition of the case. No, it should be the one at the end telling the parties how the case was decided. And from there, the Supreme Court proceeded to discuss what should be the contents of a good decision. So, an issue that was filed in court to resolve a very important constitutional issue became instead a discourse on remedial law. That's the case of Velarde versus Social Justice Society. In regard to liberty of abode and freedom of movement, just take note of some restrictions on your freedom of movement, particularly, for instance, when it concerns health matters. So last year, there were some restrictions on movements because of the swine flu, You cannot be allowed to go to those places in which the swine flu was prevalent, because when you come back, there's a possibility that you might transform your countrymen into pigs. So that is a valid limitation on your right to travel or to move about. But as a general rule, it's part of the liberty of a free society that they should be allowed to freely move about unrestrained. But take note also of the case of Budani regarding military men. So if you remember once more, General Budani and Colonel Balutan were assigned to Mindanao during the 2004 elections. And they allegedly knew some things about the irregularities then. By the time the Senate conducted hearings to find out more, General Budani and Colonel Balutan were already assigned to Baguio. They were invited to attend the hearing, and they were initially granted clearance to attend. However, on the eve of the scheduled hearing, Malacanang, through the Armed Forces Chief of Staff, notified General Budani and Colonel Balutan that they should not attend. They still attended. So when they went back to PMA, they were subjected to court-martial proceedings. The Supreme Court said that they could be validly held to account for their disregard of the orders of their superiors. And then the court also discussed about the implications of military life on freedom of movement. For those who are in the military, they cannot be as free as those outside. Those in the military are subjected to the need to secure clearances before they can go to other places. They need to inform and get the permit from their superiors. And the reason for that is that's part of military discipline, because if ever there is a need to redeploy them in an emergency, then their commanders would know where they are, so that it would be easy to respond to such emergencies. But if they are scattered all over and their commanders wouldn't know where they are, then it would really be a problem. So the Supreme Court explained that for those in uniform, they may have to sacrifice some of their liberties as a price of being in that kind of establishment. They may even be prevented, or they might even miss the birth of a newborn child or some other important family gatherings. But this is part of military strictures. So in the case of General Budani and Colonel Balutan, it was improper for them to simply have gone ahead and attend the Senate hearing when they have already been told not to leave PMA. We'll just continue with right to information tomorrow. I need to attend your testimonial. See you tomorrow.
Order. Order ko. Sakit ang ulo. Dua ka break kaya. Pero isa lang sakit.
Gaano naging po sa lang ka
First break.
Before first break, wala. Sakit na ulo. Wala pa akong pagkaon. Kailangan ko gana. Pinag-gusto ko yun sa sintahan.
nag-effect sa inyo. Tapos ko lugar magkaon kayo ng story sa Sir Mo sa